My name is Caleb Monroe, and no one in my family remembers that I was the only grandkid who read books with Grandpa. I look like the kind of guy who'd say something cryptic in a coffee shop and then disappear into the fog flannel shirt paperback in hand, too much silence around the edges. I guess you could say I've got a face for unresolved mysteries. I was the one who wheeled Grandpa around the backyard when his knees gave out, the one who helped organize his books by decade instead of alphabet. I knew the smell of his pipe tobacco better than I knew my own dad's aftershave. So when the lawyer handed Chase the entire estate with that rehearsed solemnity, I felt something shift behind my ribs, like a little laugh trying not to come out. A reality check says, if I go, you'll be cooled for skipping this part. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the Final Revenge channel. But only if you really like what I have to say here. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it could be the ultimate sweet revenge. The funeral was full of people who wouldn't recognize Grandpa's handwriting if it punched them in the throat. Most of them showed up in linen suits and fake grief, milling around the casket like it was an exhibit at some weird sadness museum. Chase wore that smug suit he always breaks out for weddings and lawsuits. He gave me the kind of nod people reserve for Uber drivers and people who lost the spelling bees. Then came the will reading in the back room of Weller and McCain, attorneys at everything. To my grandson, Chase Monroe, I leave my estate, the family house, my investments, and all remaining assets. Cue the slow turn of heads, the pursing of lips, the rustle of tailored sleeves, adjusting themselves like they were shocked. To Caleb Monroe, the lawyer continued clearing his throat and leave a box of personal effects books from my study. And that was it. Just the word books, like I was the janitor of Grandpa's imagination. The box was waiting for me in the lobby. 4 hardbacks. No note, no letter, no explanation. One of them was Grandpa's favorite novel, The Echo Paradox. A tattered first edition with coffee stains and the kind of smell that sticks to your fingers after you touch old things. When I got home, I didn't cry. I made a cup of tea like I was starring in a sad indie movie. Then I opened The Echo Paradox to the middle, where I always remembered Grandpa pausing right around page 237. I turned it slowly. Page 236. Page 238. No, 237. Just a sliver of uneven paper glued to the spine, like something had been ripped out or hidden. I tilted the book. A folded piece of paper slid out. My heart went clench mode. It wasn't a will. Not exactly. It was a note. You always read between the lines, kid. Follow the map. Don't trust the first answer. Love, G. I held that piece of paper like it was humming, like it might bite. Grandpa never believed in simple gifts. The guy once wrapped my birthday card in duct tape and buried it in the backyard. I reread the line, follow the map. What map? I flipped through every page like a raccoon in a trash can. Nothing. Then I saw it, barely visible, faded into the back cover. A ring-shaped coffee stain. But it wasn't random. It was shaped like the left wing of the estate house, complete with what looked like room outlines. And a tiny X right over the library. My phone buzzed. A text from Chase. Hope the books are thrilling. Lol. I didn't reply. I just stared at that X until my tea went cold. The next morning, I called in sick to the bookstore. I told my manager I had the flu. Not technically a lie. I did feel sick, just not from anything viral. It was more of a spiritual nausea. You ever feel like the world just rewrote your part in the script without telling you? I packed the book, the note, and a sandwich into my backpack. Then I drove out to the Monroe estate, also known as the house Chase now legally owned. The gates weren't locked yet. Figures. Chase never did sweat the details. There was a time I could sneak into the estate blindfolded, and apparently those skills hadn't atrophied. I made my way through the side garden, past the marble statue of Great-Grandpa Monroe that always looked like it was judging your GPA. A back window to the library still creaked open if you knew the trick. I slid through it like I'd done 1,000 times before. The room smelled like old leather and generational arrogance. The bookshelves stretched up 2 stories with that antique ladder that squealed like a toddler at the dentist when you moved it. I walked over to the far wall. According to the map in the coffee stain, the X was right above the fireplace. I tapped the bricks one by one. Most of them were stubborn and silent, but one sounded hollow. Oh no. Oh yes. The brick was slightly loose. I dug my fingers in and pulled. Behind it, nestled in darkness, was a steel key and a slip of paper. Check the furnace room. I hadn't been down to the furnace room since the time I got stuck there during a thunderstorm at age 12. Grandpa had rescued me with a flashlight and a knock-knock joke. I'd never appreciated him more than I did in that moment, or feared lightning more. I made my way downstairs, the key feeling heavier in my pocket with every step. The furnace room hadn't changed. Dusty, dank, smelled like forgotten birthdays and slightly burnt toast. In the far wall, behind a rack of empty wine crates, was a cast-iron safe. Round, vintage, painted in peeling green enamel, and completely out of place. I knelt in front of it. No keypad. Just a keyhole. The key slid in like it belonged there. With a deep, echoing clunk, the safe creaked open. Inside was a single envelope. Heavy, wax sealed with Grandpa's initials. It read, "To my real heir." I didn't breathe. I just sat there, envelope in hand, in the silence of a furnace room that now felt like the center of the universe. I took the envelope home like it was radioactive. I didn't open it in the car. I didn't open it while microwaving leftover lasagna. I didn't even open it right away after lighting 3 candles and putting on Miles Davis like some noir drama queen. I waited until everything was still, until it felt like I could hear Grandpa breathing in the walls. Then I cracked the seal. Inside, a letter, typewritten, very official, but not notarized. Not yet. If you're reading this, it means you found the first trail. That's good. That means you're paying attention, which is more than I can say for your brother. Already a burn. This letter isn't the final document. That would be too easy. The real one's out there. But you'll have to earn it. I left clues in 3 books I know you love. Margins, footnotes, and maybe even a dog ear or 2. I smiled despite myself. Grandpa always said dog-earing was a sin. For him to do it was like a priest spray-painting the altar. The letter continued. Each of these books contains a piece of the combination to the second safe. Yes, there are 2. You didn't think I'd make it that easy, did you? The second one's in the east wing, hidden. Trust your instincts, Caleb. They've always been sharper than you give yourself credit for. Signed, G. I held the paper for a while. Then I laid it on the table and looked at the books. There were 3 others in the box. Grandpa left me besides the Echo Paradox, Moby Dick, the Metamorphosis, and Grandpa's annotated copy of The Hollow Man. I cracked open Moby Dick first. Nothing on the cover, nothing in the beginning. But near the end, page 505, someone had scribbled something in the margin. 3rd word, line 6. Line 6 on that page. The word doubloon. Okay, cryptic but fine. I moved on to the Metamorphosis. Flipped through until a page fluttered open like it had been trained. Page 82, margin note. 5th word, line 2. The word inheritance. A bit on the nose, Grandpa. Finally, the Hollow Man. A note on the inside cover. This one's trickier. Use the cipher. You remember the cipher? Oh, come on. The cipher. He meant the one we made up when I was 10, based on Poe's stories and the Dewey Decimal System. I groaned but also laughed. Leave it to Grandpa to treat his estate like a literary escape room. All right, game on. I spent the better part of that night decoding the cipher. It wasn't just a code. It was Grandpa's sense of humor in alphabetic disguise. Turns out he'd converted page numbers into coordinates and authors' names into numeric values based on their Scrabble scores. I swear, if the man hadn't been a retired professor, he could have made a killing designing puzzle games. The final combination came out as 81 14. Now I had to find the second safe. Grandpa said it was hidden in the East Wing, which had been closed off since before I could vote. Chase never liked the East Wing. He said it smelled like wet parchment and disappointment, but I liked it. It was where Grandpa kept his broken clocks and half-built model ships and a globe with countries that didn't exist anymore. The door creaked louder than a guilt-ridden confessional. Dust floated through the air like it had ambitions. I walked past the armillary sphere and the harpsichord no one played since 1997. At the far end of the hall, just below the mounted elephant tusk, Grandpa never explained, was an old grandfather clock. It had no hands, just a face. No tick, just time frozen in place. I tapped it. Hollow. I pushed. The entire casing swung forward with a low groan, revealing a hidden chamber in the wall. Inside, Another safe. This one was more modern, sleek keypad and all. I typed in the combination. Beep, beep, beep. Click. It opened. Inside, a folder, thick, marked Last Will and Testament of Franklin T. Monroe. My mouth went dry. I reached for it and heard the floor creak behind me. Someone was there. "Don't stop on my account," came a voice. Smooth. Annoyingly familiar. Chase. He stepped into the room like it was still his. Like I was trespassing on what he'd already claimed. His arms were crossed jaw tight, like he'd just swallowed an insult he didn't quite understand. "You're really doing this?" he asked. I turned, Will still in my hand. "Doing what? This scavenger hunt? This play acting? You think finding a dusty envelope changes anything?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because I was too focused on the way his eyes flicked toward the folder. Like he was calculating Engel's exits and just how fast he'd have to move to snatch it. "It's legal," I said quietly. "Signed, witnessed, all of it." Chase scoffed. "That's your plan. Parade some hidden will and hope it sticks." I stepped back toward the fireplace. "No, my plan is to follow every breadcrumb Grandpa left. Because unlike you, I actually paid attention when he spoke." The room felt colder then, like the walls were holding their breath. He looked at me for a long time, then walked to the desk in the corner, rested one hand on it. "You really think he loved you more?" That caught me off guard. Not because of the question, but because it was the first real thing Chase had said to me in years. "I think he trusted me," I said. Silence. Then he turned and left. I stood there alone again, folder in hand, heart beating like a trapped door that just sprung. When I opened it, the truth was all there. A newer will, a complete one, not a draft, not an idea. It had all the stamps. The notary, the date just 3 weeks before he died, and it named me sole heir. I sat down on the velvet bench by the window and read every word, twice. The language was clear. The assets detailed. Even the personal notes, small touching lines Grandpa had left, just for me. One section read, "To my grandson Caleb Monroe, who has always known the weight of quiet things, I leave my library, my home, and the estate in full. May it never grow silent." I closed the folder gently. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, and somewhere I could almost hear Grandpa's voice. "You found it, kid. Now make it count." The first thing I did the next morning was find a lawyer. Not a big firm with marble lobbies and coffee machines that made 6 kinds of foam, just someone sharp, discreet, and with a reputation for making inconvenient documents become legally undeniable. His name was Jordan Pell. Former prosecutor turned estate litigator. Had a tie collection that looked like it had seen war. "I need this," Will validated, I said, sliding the folder across his desk. Jordan opened it, skimmed a few pages, then looked up. "This is substantial. I found it in a hidden safe," I said. He didn't blink, just nodded like that sort of thing happened every Thursday. "Handwriting matches? Witnesses listed? Notarized? Check, check, and check." "Well," he said, closing the folder, "then I'd say you have a case." The process moved faster than I expected. Maybe because Jordan was good. Maybe because Grandpa had dotted every I and sealed every page like he knew this day would come. We filed a petition in probate court, cited the new will, attached affidavits, served notice to Chase and the other supposed beneficiaries, none of whom frankly were thrilled. I got an email from a distant cousin asking if she'd still get the turquoise tea set. I replied with a gif of a teacup falling off a table. Chase, of course, lawyered up. His attorney was the exact kind of man you picture when you think trust fund protector. Tortoiseshell glasses, voice like cold oatmeal. He argued the timing was suspicious, the discovery convenient, and that it was highly irregular for a will to be tucked into a wall like a haunted house prize. But Jordan was ready. He showed up in court with a binder that looked like it had a spinal column. He laid out the timeline, showed the map, the books, the cipher. He even brought in the notary as a witness, who remembered Grandpa clear as gin, and confirmed everything with the precision of someone who takes signatures as seriously as bomb codes. The hearing took 2 full days. Chase barely looked at me. I wish I could say I didn't look at him either, but I did. Because part of me wanted to see some flicker of understanding, some realization that maybe this wasn't about money, that maybe it never had been. The judge took a recess before delivering her decision. I spent the break in the hallway sitting on a wooden bench that creaked like it disapproved of my spine. Jordan stood next to me, sipping coffee that smelled like it had opinions. "You nervous?" he asked. "I feel like I just confessed to a library." He smirked. "You've got this. It's airtight." "Even airtight things can leak," I muttered. Then the bailiff called us back in. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it has a heartbeat. The judge read her statement slowly, methodically. She acknowledged the validity of the new will, the credibility of the witnesses, the logic of Grandpa's eccentric but deliberate methods. Then she said the words, "I'll never forget. This court recognizes the amended will of Franklin T. Monroe as the official and binding testament. Assets are to be transferred to Caleb Monroe as outlined in the document." There was a beat of silence. Then it hit me. I'd won. Not in the movie-ending kind of way. Not with a triumphant swell of strings and hugs in the hallway. But in the slow, cold realization that everything I thought was gone had just been handed back to me. And now, I had to do something with it. Chase left the courtroom without a word. Jordan clapped me on the back. "You're the rightful heir," he said. "Make it count." And that, more than the ruling, more than the papers, felt like the true beginning. Because now I wasn't chasing Grandpa's trail anymore. I was standing at the start of my own. I didn't go to the house right away. I know it sounds weird. You win back an entire estate, and you'd think the first thing you'd do is throw open the doors, dance in the foyer, maybe dramatically tear down the velvet drapes like you're in a Jane Austen adaptation. But I waited. I needed the silence to settle first. Instead, I went back to the bookstore. Marcy, my manager, was labeling clearance paperbacks when I walked in. "Well, look who's not destitute," she said, not looking up. "I missed the smell of paper," I replied. She handed me a label gun, then labeled these Airboy. Working there again, even for just a shift, grounded me. The normalcy of it, the sound of the register, the regulars who argued about Hemingway like it was a sport, a kid who asked if we had any books with dragons and divorces in them. I pointed him to magical realism. That afternoon, I finally drove to the estate. The air smelled like memory. I unlocked the front door and the house seemed to breathe me in. Dust motes danced in the sunlight like tiny spies. The walls still remembered my footsteps. I walked room to room, slowly, no rush, as if the place needed to reacquaint itself with me. I stopped in the study, the chair where Grandpa used to sit, the stack of books, the old kettle still on the hot plate, everything untouched. I sat in the armchair and closed my eyes. The next morning, I made tea and walked through the estate with a notebook, not just as the new owner, but as someone on a mission. I made a list of things I wanted to restore: the old greenhouse, the East Wing library, the neglected piano in the music room that hadn't been played since Y2K. That's when I found the envelope tucked inside the piano bench. I almost missed it wedged behind some crumpled sheet music and a broken tuning fork. On the front, "In case you really stay." I opened it. Inside, a note in Grandpa's writing and a map. "Legacy isn't just about inheritance," the note said. "It's about continuation. You found the estate. Now make it more." The map was of the grounds, but annotated. Little notes scribbled in Grandpa's shorthand. Places circled. One area in the northwest corner of the property labeled Barn, Potential. The barn, of course. The barn had been locked for years. Last I remembered, it stored old tools, rusted bicycles, and probably a raccoon cult. But the key on the same ring that had opened the second safe fit the lock perfectly. The hinges screamed as the door opened. Dust, shadows, the smell of cedar and cobwebs, and underneath it all, structure. Good bones. I stood in the center and looked around. Wooden beams crossed overhead like quiet prayers. The light poured in through a crack in the roof, spotlighting a workbench with blueprints rolled up tight. I opened them. Monroe Writer's Retreat, they read. Floor plans, bunk setups, a kitchen, reading nooks. It wasn't just a barn. It was a dream. Grandpa hadn't just preserved his past. He planned for the future. He wanted the estate to breathe, to open to welcome. I stood there stunned, holding those dusty blueprints, and realized this wasn't the end of a trail. It was a doorway. I made 2 decisions that night. 1, I would restore the barn into exactly what Grandpa envisioned: a retreat for writers, thinkers, loners who spoke in metaphors, and people who still remembered how to read between the lines. And 2, I would do it myself. Not because I knew how to manage a renovation. I once failed to hang a picture frame straight, but because I owed it to him, to see it through, to carry the story forward. I sat at the dining table with the blueprint spread before me, a mug of tea in one hand and a pen in the other. I wrote out a list of priorities: roof repairs, window replacements. Plumbing was there, even plumbing. Insulation. Fire safety, because writers are flammable when caffeinated. I circled insulation twice. The estate got colder than a tax collector's smile after sunset. The next day, I called the contractor Grandpa used for his greenhouse rebuild. His name was Harvey, and he sounded like he only used his phone to argue with customer service. "You want to turn a dead barn into a writer's commune?" he said, voice skeptical. "A retreat," I corrected. "Is that like rehab for book nerds?" "Sort of." He showed up the next morning with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and eyebrows that looked permanently furrowed. "Place has bones," he muttered after a slow lap. "Might be haunted, though. Haunted by rejection letters." He didn't laugh. We started the work. And by we, I mean Harvey and his two assistants, both of whom looked like they were born inside hardware stores. I mostly made coffee and tried not to get in the way, but I showed up every day. I swept. I organized salvaged wood. I scrubbed 50 years of barn gilt off the walls. I even managed to install a sconce without electrocuting myself, which I marked as personal growth. Word got out. Locals started dropping by, curious, nostalgic. One elderly woman brought muffins and said she used to help Grandpa bind books by hand. He said stories need spines even when people don't. She told me. I nearly cried into a lemon poppy seed. By the third week, we had walls up. The new windows let light pour in like honey. The loft area, once coated in owl poop and existential dread, became a cozy reading space. I painted a sign to hang over the barn door. The Monroe Retreat. Underneath it, in Grandpa's handwriting, yes. I traced it from one of his notes. Where words find room to breathe. It felt right. I called Marcy that night. "You still got that old espresso machine in the back?" I asked. "The one with a vendetta against humanity?" "Sure. I'll buy it. For the retreat. Writers need caffeine. Writers also need therapy," she said. "But sure, take the machine." That weekend, I hosted our first unofficial event. Just 6 people. Friends of friends. All quiet types with notebooks. And the kind of nervous energy you find in coffee shops at 2 a.m. We lit candles, played soft jazz, and let the wind rattle the new shutters like applause. One guy read a short story about a ghost who refused to haunt until he finished his memoir. A woman read poems she'd buried after her divorce. And me, I just listened. And for the first time since Grandpa passed, I felt like the silence wasn't heavy, it was home. I didn't go to the house right away. I know it sounds weird. You win back an entire estate and you'd think the first thing you'd do is throw open the doors, dance in the foyer, maybe dramatically tear down the velvet drapes like you're in a Jane Austen adaptation. But I waited. I needed the silence to settle first. Instead, I went back to the bookstore. Marcy, my manager, was labeling clearance paperbacks when I walked in. "Well, look, who's not destitute?" she said, not looking up. "I missed the smell of paper," I replied. She handed me a label gun. "Then label these, airboy." Working there again, even for just a shift, grounded me. The normalcy of it. The sound of the register. The regulars who argued about Hemingway like it was a sport. A kid who asked if we had any books with dragons and divorces in them. I pointed him to magical realism. That afternoon, I finally drove to the estate. The air smelled like memory. I unlocked the front door, and the house seemed to breathe me in. Dust motes danced in the sunlight like tiny spies. The walls still remembered my footsteps. I walked room to room, slowly, no rush, as if the place needed to reacquaint itself with me. I stopped in the study, the chair where Grandpa used to sit, the stack of books, the old kettle still on the hot plate, everything untouched. I sat in the armchair and closed my eyes. The next morning, I made tea and walked through the estate with a notebook, not just as the new owner, but as someone on a mission. I made a list of things I wanted to restore: the old greenhouse, the East Wing library, the neglected piano in the music room that hadn't been played since Y2K. That's when I found the envelope tucked inside the piano bench. I almost missed it wedged behind some crumpled sheet music and a broken tuning fork. On the front, In case you really stay. I opened it. Inside, a note in Grandpa's writing and a map. Legacy isn't just about inheritance, the note said. It's about continuation. You found the estate. Now make it more. The map was of the grounds, but annotated. Little notes scribbled in Grandpa's shorthand. Places circled. One area in the northwest corner of the property labeled Barn in Potential. The barn. Of course, the barn had been locked for years. Last I remembered, it stored old tools, rusted bicycles, and probably a raccoon colt. But the key on the same ring that had opened the second safe fit the lock perfectly. The hinges screamed as the door opened. Dust, shadows, the smell of cedar and cobwebs, and underneath it all structure. Good bones. I stood in the center and looked around. Wooden beams crossed overhead like quiet prayers. The light poured in through a crack in the roof, spotlighting a workbench with blueprints rolled up tight. I opened them. Monroe Writer's Retreat, they read. Floor plans, bunk setups, a kitchen, reading nooks. It wasn't just a barn. It was a dream. Grandpa hadn't just preserved his past. He planned for the future. He wanted the estate to breathe and to open to welcome. I stood there stunned, holding those dusty blueprints, and realized this wasn't the end of a trail. It was a doorway. I made 2 decisions that night. 1, I would restore the barn into exactly what Grandpa envisioned, a retreat for writers, thinkers, loners, who spoke in metaphors, and people who still remembered how to read between the lines. And 2, I would do it myself. Not because I knew how to manage a renovation. I once failed to hang a picture frame straight, but because I owed it to him. To see it through, to carry the story forward. I sat at the dining table with the blueprints spread before me, a mug of tea in one hand, and a pen in the other. I wrote out a list of priorities: roof repairs, window replacements. Plumbing was there, even plumbing. Insulation, fire safety because writers are flammable when caffeinated. I circled insulation twice. The estate got colder than a tax collector's smile after sunset. The next day I called the contractor Grandpa used for his greenhouse rebuild. His name was Harvey Vaan. Ai inghenhuchi dungjien toi, jekain hao voi tongjai. You want to turn a dead barn into a writer's commune? He said, voice skeptical. A retreat, I corrected. Is that like rehab for book nerds? Sort of. He showed up the next morning with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and eyebrows that looked permanently furrowed. Place has bones, he muttered after a slow lap. Might be haunted, though. Haunted by rejection letters. He didn't laugh. We started the work. And by we, I mean Harvey and his 2 assistants, both of whom looked like they were born inside hardware stores. I mostly made coffee and tried not to get in the way, but I showed up every day. I swept. I organized salvaged wood. I scrubbed 50 years of barn guilt off the walls. I even managed to install a sconce without electrocuting myself, which I marked as personal growth. Word got out. Locals started dropping by, curious, nostalgic. One elderly woman brought muffins and said she used to help Grandpa bind books by hand. He said stories need spines, even when people don't, she told me. I nearly cried into a lemon poppy seed. By the 3rd week, we had walls up. The new windows let light pour in like honey. The loft area, once coated in owl poop and existential dread, became a cozy reading space. I painted a sign to hang over the barn door, the Monroe Retreat. Underneath it, in Grandpa's handwriting. Yes, I traced it from one of his notes, where words find room to breathe. It felt right. I called Marcy that night. You still got that old espresso machine in the back? I asked. The one with a vendetta against humanity. Sure, I'll buy it. For the retreat, writers need caffeine. Writers also need therapy, she said. But sure, take the machine. That weekend, I hosted our first unofficial event. Just 6 people. Friends of friends. All quiet types with notebooks and the kind of nervous energy you find in coffee shops at 2A. Mikum. We lit candles, played soft jazz, and let the wind rattle the new shutters like applause. One guy read a short story about a ghost who refused to haunt until he finished his memoir. A woman read poems she'd buried after her divorce. And me, I just listened. And for the first time since Grandpa passed, I felt like the silence wasn't heavy. It was home. The barn became my obsession. I spent every day there, even after the workers packed up, even after the volunteers had gone home. I stayed late with a thermos of black tea and an old camp lantern, sanding beams, and oiling wood, like I was prepping the ark. It wasn't just about finishing it. It was about making it worthy of the people who'd need it. The writers who'd arrive with shaking hands and notebooks full of almosts. The ones Grandpa believed in, the ones who didn't have voices loud enough for cities, but deep enough to echo in quiet rooms. That's when I found the floorboard. It creaked oddly. Not a protest, but a kind of invitation. I pried it up expecting rot. Instead, I found a shallow box. Inside, a single cassette tape, handwritten label, retreat rules. I didn't own a cassette player, but I knew where to find one. The next morning, I borrowed the same ancient player from the thrift store, the one I'd used for the final will recording. The woman at the register winked at me. "You finding buried treasure again, sugar?" I played the tape that night, sitting cross-legged on the barn floor with rain ticking the roof. Grandpa's voice filled the room like smoke. "If you're hearing this, then congratulations. You did it. You built the retreat. Or you're trying. Either way, that's good enough for me. But here's the deal. This place isn't about comfort. It's not about Instagrammable window seats or curated tea trays. It's about truth." A pause. "So if you run this place, you've got 3 rules. 1, no internet. If they need Wi-Fi, they need a coffee shop. 2, everyone writes, even if it's garbage. Especially if it's garbage. 3, no one leaves early unless their house is on fire or their soul is..." I laughed, cried a little too, because it was exactly what I needed to hear. The retreat opened 2 weeks later. 12 beds, 1 shared kitchen, a library of donated books, and a chalkboard that read, "Write like no one's waiting." We filled it. The first group included a barista writing a novel about a mute god, a retired vet with a sci-fi trilogy in his head, and a school teacher who whispered her poetry into soup cans before this. Every night we read by firelight, and every night I felt him. In the quiet, in the click of the kettle, in the words that didn't exist the day before. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that cracked wood and made windows sigh. The Monroe retreat still held strong, though its new insulation a minor miracle, and Harvey's handiwork a quiet fortress against frost. Guests arrived with thicker coats and thicker manuscripts. The stories got darker, quieter. One woman wrote a horror novel in the loft every night by lantern light and read it aloud over oatmeal. We called her the Oracle. No one asked why. It just fit. By December, the retreat had its rhythm. Morning writing hours, afternoon walks through the orchard, evening readings. Everyone respected the rules, especially the no Wi-Fi one. Then one night, a man showed up, not a guest, not on any list. Just walked through the snow, no luggage, holding a single book like it owed him money. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "I'm here for the Monroe story." Something in his tone made the hair on my neck salute. I asked his name. "Jonas," he said. "Used to know your grandfather." I let him in. He slept in the reading room, never asked for a proper bed. He kept to himself during the day, scribbled in the margins of that same book. It was The Echo Paradox, the first book Grandpa left me. Still smelled like pipe smoke and dusty secrets. After 2 days, he asked to speak privately. We sat in the library. He looked tired in the way very old trees look tired, like they remember storms that never made the news. "Frank left me something," he said. "A letter, a promise." He pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, a key. "I was told to give this to you, but only when the retreat was real, and only when you'd earned it." I took the key. It was brass stamped with a tiny bird. "Where does it go?" I asked. Jonas smiled. "Not where." "When..." Before I could press him, he stood up, nodded, and left the retreat without another word. Just vanished into snow. I stared at the key in my palm, heart pounding. What the hell had Grandpa planned now? I didn't sleep that night. The key with the tiny bird symbol rested on the nightstand like it had its own pulse. I kept turning it over in my fingers, feeling the ridges, wondering if not where. When was Jonas being poetic, or if this was about to get a whole lot weirder? I dug through Grandpa's notes again. His journals, his old letters. I even flipped through his annotated books, hoping for a feathered doodle or some cryptic riddle. Nothing. Until I noticed something in the retreat's main study. The old grandfather clock, the one I'd cleaned and oiled but never bothered to restart it. had a bird motif carved into the pendulum housing. I bent down and pressed my fingers along the bottom frame. Click! A compartment opened. Inside, a black notebook bound in worn leather and another map. This one older, yellowed at the edges, fragile. At the top, in Grandpa's scrawl, Project Nest. I opened the notebook. The first page read, "Time isn't a straight line. It loops in places that remember us. Find the ones that remember me." I flipped through. Symbols, dates, cryptic entries. Some read like coordinates, others like dreams. And in the back, tucked inside a paper sleeve, was a photo. Grandpa younger, maybe mid-30s, standing in front of a small cabin I didn't recognize. Next to him, Jonas. On the back, Cabin 23, Swallow Creek, 1984. I'd never heard of Swallow Creek. I searched it up in town records. Nothing. Not on maps, not on Google, not in library archives. I even asked Marcy. "Sounds like a fishing spot," she said, chewing her pen. "Or a summer camp that burned down." Why? No reason. That night, I dreamed of birds. Hey, hundreds of them, swarming out of the retreat's chimney, forming letters in the sky, all of them pointing north. I woke up with a headache and a decision. I was going to find Swallow Creek. The next morning, I packed the essentials. Grandpa's map, the brass key, a compass, and an emergency flask filled with way too strong coffee. I left a note for the retreat staff. Told them I'd be gone a few days. Then I drove. 3 hours north, then another hour west. The map directed me past marked trails deep into a stretch of forest that hadn't seen pavement in decades. Eventually, the car couldn't go any farther. I hiked the rest of the way. The woods felt old, not creepy but sacred. Like if you whispered too loud, the trees would whisper back. Finally, at dusk, I found it. Cabin 23, boarded up, ivy covered, but still standing. I walked up the steps, pulled out the key. The brass slid into the lock like it had been waiting for years. The door creaked open, and inside, everything was still, like time had folded in on itself. The air smelled like tobacco and winter. And there, on the table, was a letter, addressed to me, again. The envelope was thick, aged paper sealed with the same wax insignia Grandpa had used before. My hands trembled slightly as I broke it open. Inside was another letter typed like before. "Caleb," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you found the cabin. And more importantly, it means you're still searching." Gooden. I could almost hear his voice in every word. "This place," the letter continued, "is where everything began. Before the estate. Before the retreat. Before I became the man, everyone knew I was just a boy with a typewriter and too many questions. Swallow Creek was my sanctuary." He went on to describe a time in his 20s when he disappeared for a year, something our family only mentioned in whispers. Turns out this was where he came. To write, to hide, to listen. To build this cabin, I borrowed lumber time and a promise from Jonas. It was here we decided we'd protect something worth keeping, memory, legacy, truth. Project Nest wasn't just about secrecy. It was about continuity. And you, Caleb, are the next keeper. My breath caught. At the bottom of the letter was a coded riddle. Take the book with no title. Where page 47 meets the candle, listen twice. No title. I scanned the shelves. There weren't many books, just 5 mostly falling apart. But one had no spine text, no markings at all. I opened to page 47. A single word was circled. Echo. I remembered the tape recorder in my bag. I placed it on the candle-burned table and pressed play. A second recording played. Grandpa's voice again. "This is the last clue. You're almost there. Look behind the false wall in the fireplace. There you'll find the final key." I turned slowly to the stone fireplace, tapped along the edge. Nothing. Then at the center, a hollow thunk. I pried gently. A panel popped loose. Inside was a steel box. And another key, stamped with the initials C. M, my name. The steel box was heavier than it looked. I carried it to the table, wiped off the soot, and slid the key marked C, M, into the lock. It turned smoothly with a quiet click, the kind that felt final. Inside was a bundle of documents, a small velvet pouch, and a sealed envelope. The documents came first. They weren't legal papers this time. They were notes, dozens of pages hand-typed and annotated in Grandpa's looping script. The title at the top of the first page read, Legacy Draft Larser. 0 for Caleb. I read the first paragraph. This is not a book for publication. This is a blueprint. If you've made it here, it means you've already built the retreat. You've understood what matters. But there's one more step. I kept reading. The notes outlined an expansion, not just the physical kind. Not more cabins or another barn, but a network, a movement. Imagine 10 places like Monroe, one in every corner of the country. Hidden, protected, sacred, where people can write, speak, confess. Not everyone has a sanctuary, Caleb. You can give them that. My heart was pounding. The velvet pouch held a small gold pin shaped like a nest. I recognized it immediately. Grandpa used to wear it on his old wool coat. The envelope held one thing, a bank routing slip, and a number, a very, very large number, a hidden fund earmarked under a trust named Project Nest. I leaned back in the chair. Grandpa had left me the estate. But this was the real inheritance. He didn't just want me to keep the story going. He wanted me to spread it. The storm outside picked up. The windows shook. But inside that cabin, I felt warmer than I had in months. I stayed up all night making lists. Cities, contacts, writers I knew. People who'd applied and never gotten a spot. Places that felt forgotten. And then I started drafting the letter. A call to arms. A letter not just from me, but from a legacy. Dear writer, I typed. There's a place for you. Maybe not yet, but soon. We're building it. Brick by word. Beam by truth. Hold tight. You're not alone. By dawn, I had 12 copies printed and folded. I sealed each with wax. Same insignia as Grandpa's. Same initials. When I returned to the Monroe retreat, the snow had melted into slush, and the orchard smelled like wet bark and thawing roots. I stepped inside just as the afternoon workshop was ending. A circle of writers sat around the fireplace, sharing half-written sentences and unsure metaphors. Someone laughed. Someone cried. I didn't interrupt. I just watched what we'd built, this weird, stubborn sanctuary for stories. Harvey caught me in the hallway. You vanish, then show up smiling like a sitcom dad. You okay? Better, I said. And we're expanding. He raised an eyebrow. What, like a patio? More like a movement. He grunted. You'll need more insulation. Over the next month, I sent the letters out one by one. Some to writers, some to artists, some to former librarians, bookstore owners, that guy who ran a mobile poetry truck in Michigan. All of them people who'd tried to make the world quieter, then got shouted over. Most never replied, but 3 did. One woman from New Mexico who taught storytelling in prisons. One man from Maine who'd been ghostwriting for politicians and hated himself for it. And a couple from Oregon who lived in a converted school bus and hosted poetry nights in the woods. They became the seeds. We met on Zoom. I shared the blueprint, the philosophy, the rules, the pin, and they got it. They started building, and the thing began to grow. People whispered about these little cabins tucked in forests, coastlines, deserts, places with no internet and too many pens, places where writing wasn't just an act, it was a kind of prayer. And then one day I got a package, no return address, inside, a journal, filled, every page packed with messy, furious, trembling words. At the end, a note. I was going to give up. Then I came here. Now I don't want to leave. I closed the book, sat in the retreat garden, and let the silence settle around me like a warm coat. This wasn't just mine anymore. It was becoming theirs. Chase showed up at the retreat unannounced. It had been over a year since the court ruling. I hadn't heard a word from him. Not a letter, not a threat, not even a passive-aggressive birthday text. And then, one morning, there he was, standing by the gate arms, crossed expression, unreadable. I walked out to meet him, heart steady. Hey, I said. He nodded. Nice place. You here to sue me again? No, he said too quickly. I read about this. Movement. Monroe chapters. Word sanctuaries. I figured you were behind it. I raised an eyebrow. And I want in. I laughed. Not out of mockery, more like disbelief. You wanted it all, remember? The estate. The power. You got neither. Now you want the scraps. His face darkened. You think I don't feel that loss. That shame. You think I don't lie awake wishing I'd listened. I stayed quiet. He looked away. I was angry. Entitled. But you? You built something. People talk about this place like it's sacred. I wanted a throne. You gave them a chapel. That struck something. I exhaled. This isn't a franchise. It's not scalable. It's alive. It breathes. I'm not here for control, he said. "I'm here to learn." We walked through the orchard in silence. Later, he sat in on a writing circle. He didn't share, just listened. His posture changed. Shoulders lowered, eyes softened. That night, I found him in the library. "Still want in?" I asked. He nodded. I handed him an empty journal and a fountain pen. "No shortcuts," I said. "No titles, just pages." And he accepted it, without a word, without ego. That's when I knew Grandpa's plan was bigger than we imagined. It wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. And Chase, my brother, had finally started writing. The first annual gathering happened in early spring. People came from all over, Maine, New Mexico, Alberta. Some drove, some flew, a few hitchhiked. They brought journals, folded letters, poems on napkins. They came to Monroe Retreat like pilgrims, exhausted but expectant. We hosted it in the barn, now strung with warm lights and smelling of cedar and ink. We moved the long tables aside and filled the room with pillows, blankets, and chairs that didn't match. It was perfect. No keynote, no panels, just circles, conversations. Truth. On the second night, we lit a fire in the orchard. Each person stood and read something they'd once hidden. A father who lost custody read a lullaby he'd written for the daughter he missed. A teenager from Idaho recited the first sentence she ever believed in. And Chase, trembling but upright, read a letter he'd written to our grandfather but never sent. "I didn't deserve your legacy," he read, "but I'll spend the rest of my life earning it." No one clapped, but someone reached out and held his hand. The third day, I shared Grandpa's final tape. Not the will, not the retreat rules, but a recording I hadn't played until then. Stories. Grandpa said, his voice quieter now, are seeds. We don't always get to see what they grow into, but we plant them anyway. Because someday, someone will need shade. That night, the fire lasted until dawn, and no one wanted to leave. The retreat is quieter now. The guests have gone. The orchard hums, and I sit in the study journal in my lap, the fire hissing like a sleepy friend. It's been 2 years since Grandpa passed, and I've finally stopped trying to become him, because what he built wasn't a mirror. It was a path. I still get letters, dozens a week, some asking for space, some asking for hope, some just asking if the world still allows room for softness. And I tell them yes, because somewhere there's a cabin in the woods, a chair in the corner, a blank page waiting, and a story that's still being written. I light the last candle. The wax pools like memory, and I whisper to no one and everyone, "Thanks, Grandpa." Then I write the next line.